Hey there, I'm Joey. I'm the founder of a new ministry called Restored. We help teenagers and young adults who come from broken families to heal and grow so they can feel whole again and thrive. One of the biggest problems, one of the biggest struggles that I see young people from broken families face is they are afraid of repeating the cycle of dysfunction and divorce that they saw in their parents' marriage. And it terrifies us so much that so many of us even run away from marriage. We want nothing to do with it. And part of the reason it's so scary is because statistically, we are more likely to get divorced ourselves. And I felt this fear so strongly in my life. I remember when I was 14 years old, I liked this great girl, but I was so afraid that it wasn't going to work out because I saw the way that my parents' marriage had fallen apart. And so I kind of became obsessed with the question, how do I avoid that? How do I not go down that path? How do I build love that lasts? And so I want to give you a few tips that experts have found can really, really help to build love that lasts. But before I get into that, I think it's important to start with the problem and give a little bit of an understanding of why people like us who come from broken families typically struggle more in relationships. And the reason is pretty simple. Basically, we lack a roadmap for love. We've seen a broken model of love in marriage. More than anyone else, our parents teach us how to love, how to be loved. And if we saw a really broken model of what that looks like, when it's our turn to do it, we're kind of lost. We don't know how to build love that lasts. And so I am here to tell you that there is so much hope. You can build a healthy marriage. You can build a beautiful family. It's going to take some work, but I've seen really beautiful couples, people who've come from broken families go on to build really beautiful marriages, really beautiful families. And so it is possible for you. Again, it's going to take some hard work, but it is possible for you. And so like I mentioned, I want to give you 3 tips on how you can build love that lasts. Now, don't be fooled by the simplicity of these tips. It's one thing to know it. It's a good thing if you know it, but the real test is whether you live this stuff out in your life. Tip number 1, build virtue. The first tip has nothing to do with your relationship. It has everything to do with you. It starts with you. Why is that? Because you are the lid on your marriage. Your marriage will only be as healthy, happy, and holy as you are individually. Another way to say it is our relationships tend to reflect our personal condition. And what I've seen in the great marriages that I've been blessed to know and observe is that the more virtuous the spouse is, the happier the marriage. Always. And so build virtue in your own life. And the question becomes, how do you build virtue? It's a big topic, but a few tips from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. They give a 4-part framework. Number 1, education. We need to learn the virtues. Number 2, deliberate acts. We need to practice them like any other skill in our lives. 3, perseverance in those acts. We need to do this again and again. It can't just be one time here, one time there. And finally, we need God's grace in order to live out the virtues. And I would add one thing to that, not to correct the catechism by any means, but it's really a prerequisite to those 4 points, and that is we need a growth mindset. A growth mindset is the belief basically that you can change, you can grow, you can become better. The opposite of a growth mindset is a fixed mindset where you believe you kind of are the way that you are, you can't change, you can't grow. And so in order to build a beautiful marriage, you need to build virtue. In order to build virtue, you need a growth mindset. So tip number 1, build virtue. Tip number 2, find a virtuous spouse. Years ago, my spiritual director, who was a devout Catholic priest, kind of shocked me. He said, Joey, it's better to date a woman who isn't Catholic but is virtuous than to date a woman who isn't virtuous but is Catholic. Now, thankfully, you can find one who has both, but his point shocked me, and it really taught me that choosing a spouse is not a trivial matter. It's not something that should be left up to the emotions alone. We need to find a virtuous spouse. And so what types of virtues should we look for? Certainly all of the virtues, but just a few that I'd mention that I'd highlight. One is the virtue of chastity. Why is this so important? We hear about chastity a lot in the Catholic world. Why is this so important? Because at the core of chastity is self-mastery. And you really want to find a person who has that self-mastery, who has the ability to sacrifice for you, for your relationship, for your family. Also, once you get married, lust doesn't just disappear when you put on the ring. You still have to battle with it. And if we're not careful, if we don't battle against lust and live out pure lives, lust will destroy our marriages. Absolutely. Infidelity, as you probably know, is one of the top causes of divorce. Another virtue to look out for in a person is humility. Humility is the foundation of all the virtues. Part of the reason it's so helpful within marriage is you're going to hurt each other a lot. And so it gives you the ability to own up to what you've done, to apologize, and even offer forgiveness. And then another one I would say is empathy. Empathy is so important, especially in the midst of conflict, which is inevitable within marriage, because it gives you the ability to take yourself and put yourself, because it gives you the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, which is so important for handling conflict. Another question you can ask yourself is, do you want your children to be just like this person? If the answer is no, then you need to take a serious look at whether this person is right for you. It's also important to talk about your past mistakes. This can be really hard. I know this firsthand. I had to do this with my now wife when we were dating. Just opened up to her about things that I had done in the past. And one tip that I heard from Emily Wilson to make this a bit easier is just asking the question, is there anything that you haven't told me that you're afraid to tell me? That can spark really good, vulnerable, honest conversations that can help your relationship grow so much. And when you're talking about mistakes in the past, especially sexual mistakes, make sure not to reveal too many details. Jason Everett says that the more details you reveal often does more harm than good. And also be careful when you're assessing the virtue of another person. John Paul II in Love and Responsibility, he said that as a rule, we exaggerate the goodness, the virtue of the person that we're in love with. He says this always happens, as a rule, to everyone. And so it's important that we are brutally honest and we ask the question, is this person actually virtuous? And one way to assess that is involve people in your relationship, people that you trust, people who can give you feedback. And if they're not giving you open feedback, go to them and ask them, hey, are you seeing any red flags? Is there anything in our relationship that concerns you? And then be humble enough to receive the feedback that they have to give you. It will go a long way in helping you figure out if this is the person that you're meant to marry. What researchers have found too is that if you can get on the same page, or find someone rather, who's on the same page in 4 areas, your likelihood of sticking together, of having a happy, successful marriage goes up a ton. And the first area is your relationship with God, what you believe. Second is parenting, like how many kids to have, how to raise them. Third is money. How do you spend your money? How do you save? And finally, your in-laws. How do you navigate those relationships with your families? But perhaps the best advice that I've received is from Curtis Martin when he said, don't pursue your soulmate, pursue God. And after a while of running after him, turn to see who's keeping up with you. Tip number 3, learn to handle conflict well. This is so important because, like I said, conflict within marriage is inevitable. It's going to happen. One author said that conflict is the price you pay for intimacy. And if you're in a relationship or you've seen marriages where it seems like they don't fight, it means one of 2 things. Either they are saints or there's something wrong with that relationship. And so what we want to do when it comes to conflict is just make it healthy. It can actually be a really good, fruitful thing if we try to make it healthy. How do you do so? Well, Dr. John Gottman and his team of researchers have studied marriages and conflict for the past 30 years. And what they would do is they would invite married couples to their lab, which doubled as a fancy apartment, and they would study how the couple would interact, especially when it came to conflict. And so what they observed is when the couple handled conflict well, they apparently, up to a 95% accuracy, could predict whether the couple would stay together or not. But if they didn't handle the conflict well, they were typically looking for one of 4 bad signs. Dr. Gottman called these the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse because it signaled that there's trouble ahead and it's likely that this marriage will not last. The first bad sign is criticism. So psychologists say that criticism is not the same thing as complaining. Complaining is where you have a negative comment about someone's action. Criticism, on the other hand, is insulting or attacking a person really in an unconstructive way. The second bad sign is contempt. Now, contempt and criticism are similar, but they're different. Dr. Gottman says that contempt is the intention to insult and psychologically harm your partner. And what that looks like in a marriage is name-calling, sarcasm, and mockery. Number 3 is defensiveness. This really is the result of criticism and contempt. We just feel so attacked that we put up our shield and defend ourselves. And what this looks like in a marriage is just overall making excuses, being unwilling to take ownership, and blaming the other person. And number 4 is stonewalling. We become so overwhelmed with the conflict and the drama in the relationship that we just kind of check out. We emotionally avoid the other person. We just kind of give up. And apparently he says that 85% of stonewallers are men. So this is a strong tendency and men. Now, if these show up in your relationship or in your future marriage, perhaps, it doesn't mean that your relationship is doomed. It simply means that you have some work to do and you need to get professional help like right now. So if that's the wrong way to handle conflict, what's the right way? Well, psychologists and experts have a few tips on that. The first one is let the small things go. It's so easy to make a big deal of everything in marriage, but we really need to learn to let the small things go. This tip alone has helped me a lot in marriage. I've learned to extend grace to my wife, especially in the middle of the night when the baby's up. Really, really helpful. The second tip is practice empathy. So put yourself in the shoes of the other person. One simple tip to do that in an argument and some sort of conflict is repeat back to the person what you hear them saying, just to make sure that you truly understand what it is that they're trying to communicate. And number 3, take a break. Take a break. Our counselor, my wife and I, have gone to marriage counseling, and our counselor taught us this. Basically, when emotions are getting high, when things are getting kind of dramatic in an argument, you might need to call a timeout. And so before you get into that situation, you and your spouse would agree that if we need a timeout, it would be for this set amount of time, anywhere from 15 minutes to 24 hours. Usually don't want to go longer than that. But let's say in this case that the timeout is 3 hours. So in the midst of a conflict, one of you would call a timeout. You'd say, hey, we need a second. We're getting a little bit riled up here. And so you go your separate ways, and the person who called the timeout, they would be the one to keep track of the time, and they would also be the one to resume the conversation. And this has been so helpful, partly because what our counselor told us is that for those of us who have an average IQ, when we're angry, our emotional intelligence goes down about 30 points. And again, for those of us with 100 IQ, that puts us about 70, which is the level of mental disability. And so we really can't act well, we can't control the words that we say well when we're that worked up. Now, certainly more could be said, but I just want you to know that if you work at it, you can build a healthy, happy marriage. You can build the family that you've always longed for, perhaps the one that you wish you would have had growing up. It is possible for you in particular. It won't be perfect, but it will be good. It will be beautiful. And as you work toward building love that lasts, please know that my ministry is here for you. One resource that we recently put out is this book. It's called It's Not Your Fault, A Practical Guide to Navigating the Pain and Problems from Your Parents' Divorce. It features 33 questions and answers on the most pressing challenges faced by young people who come from broken families. If you want the first chapters free, just click the link in the description. On that page, click Get Free Chapters, put in your name, your email, and then we'll email you the free chapters. So if you want them, go ahead and get those chapters now. Thank you so much for watching. We do it for you.